Thank you. Eminences, excellencies, and excellence, who are all the rest of you. I'm deeply, deeply honored to be amongst you. I think it's a real testament to your emotional and social intelligence in displaying the competencies of inclusion and celebration of diversity. And I say that because it is a very strange path that has led me here. It's more akin really to a very dark underground tunnel. Until 4 years ago, I was a filmmaker. And the last film I made changed my life forever and was to prove the last film I will ever make, because it gave me a set of insights that was so blinding that I had to become a campaigner for a system change in education and an activist, which is what I now consider myself to be. You will all, I think, or many of you will remember an incredibly brutal gang rape that took place on a moving bus in Delhi, in India. It happens to have taken place there. Of course, we know that brutality, violence, gang rape, and all manner of appalling violent acts are perpetrated all over the world with equal regularity. But I went to India to make a film about this particular gang rape, and I soon realized that there was only point in making this film if I could sit with the 6 men who had gang raped this girl on the bus, and had not only gang raped her, I say in inverted commas, but had ended up pulling her intestines out of her body and throwing her at the side of the road to die, naked and bleeding. And I did sit with 3 of those 6 men and met a 4th and spent 20 minutes with them. But I spent 31 hours in prison cells interviewing rapists. I just want to take you through a handful of the insights that I gleaned on this journey. The first real shock was that these men were not by any means the monsters that I had prepared myself to meet. And I wish they had been. I would have been much more reassured. These were ordinary, unremarkable human beings. And their answers to my 150 questions, which I had very carefully compiled with psychologists and forensic psychologists, their answers were pat and virtually identical. What became absolutely abundantly clear was that these men had been robotically programmed to think as they think, and therefore I say to act as they acted. So I actually believe there was an inevitability about what they did. They felt absolutely no remorse or regret, nor did they express any, not for 1 second in 31 hours. I found that quite remarkable. And they didn't express any regret because genuinely they didn't believe they had done wrong. In fact, they said that this girl who was out after dark and therefore flouting every patriarchal regulation that pertains to a girl in that society, because she was out with a boy who was neither her husband nor her brother, she not only deserved what she got, they said they had a duty to teach her a lesson. That can only come from socio-cultural thinking that has been passed to them in the most entrenched way. And I want to tell you about two more insights because they're very relevant. Obviously, I was looking at this case through a gender-based violence lens. But I soon discovered that it's not just about gender, and therefore the ensuing program and movement that I went on to create has gender equality very much as one of the competencies that it imparts or mediates, but that is one of 25 competencies and skills that this program mediates. And the reason for that was an interview that I had with one rapist, who was not in this particular case, who had raped a 5-year-old girl, and I sat with him for 3 hours. And when I asked him at the end of this interview to help me to understand, very unjudgmentally, I just asked him to help me to understand how he could go from contemplating this brutal act while he was looking at this fragile little creature, how could he actually act on it? And he looked at me like I was the stupidest human being who had ever crossed his threshold, asking him the stupidest question he'd ever heard, and he said, word for word, he said, she was a beggar girl, her life was of no value. So that lack of value ascribed to the other, to another human being, is fundamental to those acts of brutality and violence. And what I discovered, I suppose, in a nutshell, is that the violence is not the disease. The violence is the symptom of the disease. The disease is the discriminatory mindset. And is it really any different, I asked myself, to call and label and then treat the Jews like vermins and rats, or the infidels like, worthless, mistaken human rubbish that should be beheaded, or the cockroaches and dogs that the Hutus dubbed the Tutsis before going in to try and annihilate them? Is there much difference between that and what these men did? No, there isn't. And so if it is mindset that we're grappling with, how do we change mindset? Well, of course, there's only one way to change mindset, and that is education. But at the very point where all my attention and the spotlight of my thinking fell upon education, something extraordinary happened. I had come to the conclusion that it was education that, was a definite factor in this, also partly because I looked for the common thread between these rapists, and I found that only one of them had finished secondary school. So I jumped to the conclusion, lazy, as I now know, that the lack of education had something to do with it. And within 2 weeks of that certainty, I was interviewing their lawyers, who had enjoyed the highest degree of access to education and came across as far worse than the rapists themselves. One of the lawyers actually said to me, if that girl on the bus had been my daughter, I would take her to my farmhouse, and in front of my whole family, I would pour petrol on her and burn her alive. A lawyer. So what does that mean? It means it's not the education that we think of when we say education, nor is it mere access to education, though obviously the point made this morning is patently true, that you need them within the education system in order to educate, but it is contents of education that suddenly loomed as key for me. And it found its expression for me in Mandela, who said education is the most powerful weapon we have to change the world, and I absolutely knew what he was talking about in terms of the mindset change that is required to change the world. But what kind of education was he talking about? Well, I found it in the quote on this slide below. No child is born hating another human being. A child has to be taught to hate, and if he can be taught to hate, he or she can be taught to love. And so that is where the mission, the movement of Think Equal was born. Its vision, a safe, free, and equal world. Its mission to bring what we believe is the missing subject, that missing third dimension to education, which must join numeracy and literacy and the testing of it, and we believe should be at least the core purpose of early years education. Of course, I believe it should continue throughout the school pipeline. We, as an organization, focus only on 3 to 6, and in a moment I'll tell you why. But ideally, we advocate for it to become compulsory in early years. I ask education ministers when I meet them, how can you, who have a duty of care to our youngest citizens, how can you deem it to be compulsory for our children to learn to form letters and numbers, literacy, numeracy, but it's optional for them to learn how to value another human being, and it's optional for them to learn how to lead healthy relationships? This cannot be right. These are the competencies and skills that our program teaches. We'll talk in a moment about the structure of the program and how long is spent, but obviously I'm not going to go through all of them, but you will see there a number of competencies and skills that I haven't found taught in any other holistic program in early childhood, and I would be really, really grateful if any of you know of any, because we are constantly looking for best practice to include, like gender equality, for example. Interestingly, I looked up in preparation for today the World Economic Forum list of competencies for what they dub 21st century skills, which always makes me giggle because, quite frankly, you know, it suggests that we didn't need it in any other century. Although at least it's not as insulting as the term soft skills, which suggest that it's not of particular value. I mean, the connections made in the brain for empathetic response is as hard a connection as the connection for 2 + 2 = 4. But interestingly, the 4 competencies that the World Economic Forum called for in 2016 were collaboration, critical thinking / problem solving, so that's 1, creativity, and communication. Now, it leaps out at me, apart from the cute convenience of choosing words beginning with the letter C, which perhaps has nothing to do with the true breadth of the competencies that are needed, but nonetheless, convenient, also begins with C. Nonetheless, it also occurs to me that these are all looking through the lens of education as a path to the labor market. You'd need those competencies for a job, but not necessarily to grow up and not rape. Not necessarily to grow up and not become depressed, or not be able to deal with loss, or not commit suicide, etc. I'm getting worried about time now, so I'm going to skip through some of these. Maria Montessori, who put the child at the center, and speaks about the child as the agent of social change. Gandhi said, I don't have a slide for this, but Gandhi said, if we want to achieve real peace in the world, we shall have to begin with the children. And of course, this is a graph I don't have to dwell on. I'm sure you're all familiar with this. The pink line and the dark blue line being the most relevant here, habitual ways of responding, emotional control, virtually flat line at the age of 6. This is why we decided, with our limited resources, limited capacity, and limited time, because I'm getting on, as you can see, to focus very narrowly on the early years of 3 to 6. Interesting statistic, the top 25 hedge fund managers in the USA made more than double the salary in this particular year that we looked at for this statistic than all the kindergarten teachers in the USA put together. That tells us something pretty extraordinary about priorities and values. So, this arena of early childhood is not without obstacles and difficulties, one of the greatest of them being that early years education has been deemed to be the space for babysitting, pretty much, to free up the parents to go off in pursuit of what we have taught them is the purpose of life, which is accumulation of wealth. So the children don't really need education in those early years, is the idea behind that. So you don't have to pay the teachers much. You don't have to train them much, and you certainly don't respect them much. Well, this is a real problem when you wake up as a world suddenly, some 10 years ago, and realize that early years education is the very key. It's the cornerstone of sustainable development. So we designed this program, this is just to explain why. We designed the program as a vaccination. It's prescriptive. In the face of a pandemic or an epidemic, you would not say to the nurses, you decide, take a bit of this, a bit of that, you know, somehow put together a vaccination to stop this disease from spreading. And likewise, we are looking at preventing the epidemics of discrimination and violence and suicide and ill health and lack of well-being. And in doing so, we have had to make this prescriptive because until the teachers are profoundly, deeply trained over a number of years, how else will we get them to understand how to mediate? So we give them step-by-step instructions. That's another insistence we had in order to scale, because if we believe this is the right of every child, then there's no point in having it in a few thousand schools. It's got to be in every school, ideally in every home, but how do we get into the homes? But anyway, we have brought the price of this to a price point of $2 per child per year. It costs $38,000 per year to incarcerate one violent offender, and it costs $38,000 to teach 19,000 children this program. These are some of the thought leaders who have either given us best practice materials which we've incorporated or have helped us create, because of course a lot of what we've created has been from scratch. I'm going to zip through these because I'm very aware of the time. But the structure of the program, we have 3 levels. Level 1 is 3 to 4-year-olds, level 2, 4 to 5, level 3, 5 to 6-year-olds. And each level has, it runs over 30 weeks because we say this is a full-on subject that deserves the same attention and ring-fenced gravitas as we afford to maths or the sciences. 3 lessons per week, 40 minutes each lesson. Mercifully, in the early years, so far, we haven't come across clashes in timetables where teachers are saying, oh, we don't have time for this. And that is in 18 countries so far, so we're keeping fingers crossed for the others. So essentially, it's 60 hours of guided social emotional learning per year, and the lessons have to be taught in whole and not in part, and that's the one deal we do with the teachers, because we give it to the teachers for free. We will never charge a teacher or a school for this program, because once we do that, we start up another landscape of inequity where only the schools that can afford it will teach it. I'm definitely not going into any of this. This is part of the pedagogy behind it all. Anyone who wants to see our curriculum framework, please let me know. I'll leave cards on the table in case you do want our theory of change. Let's get to the more action-oriented and practical things. Well, the importance of narrative, I must pause here because as an ex-filmmaker, of course, I know that you can only learn empathy through story and characters. Experientially, you cannot wag a finger at a child or a human being and say, put yourself in that person's shoes. It's theoretical and meaningless. You have to take their little hearts and squeeze them through the stories. So we have created 80 books, narrative books. Some of them are about climate literacy. I was showing Ram one at lunchtime. We teach them to recycle, etc., from the age of 3. Again, the importance of narrative, well, essentially what we're doing is taking the individual narrative, meeting the child where he or she is at, and through these competencies and skills, we are creating a new collective narrative of, global citizenry and being empathetic, loving, caring, good citizens. That's the lesson plan structure. You have your objectives or outcomes for each lesson, the resources which we hand over to the teachers together with the 23 books per year, per level. 7 weeks of the program are the kindness curriculum or the C curriculum written by Professor Richard Davidson and the Dalai Lama, or Emory University and the Dalai Lama in the case of C, and they don't need books. So that's why we have 23 books out of 30 weeks. And then the action part, which is the key. It's step by step. It is the IKEA of the education world. Here is your flat pack and a set of instructions. You don't have to have gone to carpentry school for 3 years. Obviously, it's better if you have. Obviously, we cry out for teachers who will be trained deeply and beautifully, but we realize that the vast majority of them are not, and we're in an emergency and we're racing against time to 2030. So we have to do it another way for now. There you have your instructions as specific as this. Gather the children together in a circle, ask the children to look at their friends, and we're asking questions and we're eliciting learning that is co-constructed. We're not just pouring information into their heads. Why is this not? It is. Just some resources. You see there the girl astronaut, the boy astronaut. I'll just pick out a couple of things. This teaches the children about what colors we human beings are. And this particular lesson teaches them that whereas they will say that I am white and the girl with the blonde hair in that top left-hand corner is white, and they will say that the girl in the middle is black, we, with brown crayons, show them that if the girl up there were white, she would match that exterior of the paper. I'm doing this in a different way now just for convenience, to be quick. The girl in the middle, if she were black, what color's her hair then? We ask the children, right? Because actually, nobody is black or white. All of the human beings on earth are different shades of brown. Every single one of us. And we prove this to the children with a brown crayon. We're either light brown or darker brown or dark brown, but nobody is black and white. And why is this important? Well, of course, we know about racism and race hate crimes, but also because before long they're starting to learn metaphors that has the word black as everything and anything negative. Black mark against your name, black sheep in the family, the black heart of the villain, etc. This is not acceptable, it is not factual, nor is it accurate. So that's just an example of how concrete the learning is. The Ruler program is incorporated, thanks to Dr. Mark Brackett at Yale's Center for Emotional Intelligence. They've allowed us to use it for free in our program. And the kindness curriculum I've already spoken of. You all know the importance of early learning, so I'm ignoring that. The Think Equal outcomes, I think I've covered. Sorry, I've got to make it in 30 seconds. We have proof of concept in Botswana. I'm obviously not going to read it to you now, but I'm happy to show it to anybody who's interested in seeing it. This is where Think Equal can currently be found in these countries. The green countries are where we're working with government. And the green bold countries, Mexico and Belize, in Belize they have agreed to make this program compulsory for every single child in Belize, and in Mexico they're on the verge of doing so. Can I have 2 more minutes? 1 minute, okay. This is the most extraordinary opportunity I can think of, and I just want to make a little cri de coeur and beg, plead with all of us to use the opportunity of having these excellents together in this room and this amazing global compact coming up to present programs, and there clearly are so many brilliant programs in this room, to actually say we are a task force as part of this global compact who are going to be giving detailed plans of programs in countries, and we will help to implement them, but for us all to be that world community that Jeff is looking for, the task force, the implementers of action, and not just, again, awareness and a host of broken promises. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Leslie, for a very fascinating presentation. When you were speaking about your disappointment after speaking with a lawyer of this criminal, it came to my mind, I'm a German, there was no country with a higher levels of PhD and a better, not only university, but also school education than Germany in the 20s. Didn't prevent it from doing terrible crimes. So I partly